Hi everyone, and welcome to this Eden Formation training session. We are here with Will van der Hart and Rob Waller from the Mind and Soul Network. Will is an Anglican vicar in West Harrow in London, and Rob is a consultant psychiatrist up in Scotland. So welcome to you both. Thank you for being with us. If you could just tell us a little bit about the Mind and Soul Network as we begin.
Just very quickly, Mind and Soul is good theology, good psychology coming together. Will's experience, my experience, and there's 3 or 4 other people involved as well. Just trying to bring you the best of both. I think we need both, and I think they both play off each other.
Fantastic, thank you. I think mental health is such an important issue in the kind of ministry that we're engaged in, and today we're going to be looking at depression and anxiety and how those things can impact us in our ministry and also the people that we're seeking to engage with. So for me, I think depression can be a great leveller, actually. We all encounter hard times in our lives. We're all vulnerable to periods of low mood and depression. Different issues might provoke those. Different issues might affect me to the issues that affect the people in my community that I seek to come alongside. But ultimately, we're all vulnerable to some extent. And we find that within the Eden Network that we have had lots of people struggle over their years with depression and anxiety issues. The nature of the ministry is that it can be challenging. I always say to people in our recruitment process, Eden will push your buttons at some point. The question is, how are you going to respond to that when it does? And are you ready to actually begin to address the issues when they're actually prodded by the work in the community? And so it's a real issue for us in the kind of ministry that we're involved in. Rob, perhaps it would be helpful for you to start by just giving us a bit of a download on what is depression? What is it that we're dealing with here?
Yeah. I mean, it's a big term. It means different things to different people. So I guess for most people it means low mood. To me as a doctor, you know, a depressive illness is perhaps towards the more severe end of that spectrum. It's usually something that comes in episodes, so affects people perhaps a number of times during their life. But there may be elements of low mood and a tendency to think negatively in between. It comes from, there's a genetic component to it. Early environment is very important in terms of supportive or not supportive parenting, traumas in childhood, right the way through from just a generally chaotic childhood, sometimes specific abuse, and of course life events as we go through life. And different life events will affect different people. So for some people it could be losing a job, for some people it could be the ending of a relationship. Again, it all comes down to what are the buttons, and I guess each of us have got different buttons and each of us will be tipped in. Some depression can occur postnatally. So there's an excess of women who have depression, and a lot of that comes from postnatal depression. And there's also a group of people who perhaps start off with an anxiety disorder, perhaps a panic attack, agoraphobia, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then because they're doing less as a result of their anxiety, they become depressed after that.
Yeah. So how do you tell the difference then between a particularly melancholic personality or just a bad day or a tough time and someone who's actually getting to the point where you would describe their condition as depressive?
Well, there's the Eeyore character or the Puddleglum character from Narnia, and you say to him, oh, it's a wonderful day, and the response is, most likely rain this afternoon. And there is that sort of, you know, the glass is always half empty sort of character style. And some people are sensitive, some people are slightly neurotic in their personality. Ironically, they're often good listeners. They're often the people who go into ministry, who go into pastoral work because they have that sensitivity, that they're in touch with their emotions. But that's not depression because they're still functioning. And actually that's a strength. You know, we must never think that sensitivity is a weakness. It's not, it's a strength. But what I'm looking for in depression is, I guess, first and foremost, a change. You know, the person was doing fine and now they're not. The wheels are starting to come off. Also what we call biological symptoms of depression. So it's not the mood that perhaps is the most obvious thing. It's the poor concentration, disrupted sleep, weight loss, decreased interest in sex and relationships. It's those kinds of bodily symptoms of depression. Everything is depressed, not just your mood. And I guess the third thing that we'd look for is the prevalence of very negative thinking, perhaps even suicidal thinking.
Yeah. And I guess what I'm thinking about in the context of our Eden ministry is that we work in communities where depression is often endemic, where a lot of people are out of work, a lot of people are long-term sick. There's low aspiration generally amongst the young people that we work with, low self-esteem, people whose lives are very complicated. It can actually be a generally quite depressing environment. I mean, how have you found that working in central London?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Anna. The environment that we work in can have a really strong impact on the potential for us developing a depressive experience or depressive episode in ourselves. Rob's mentioned all of some of the outworkings of depression. I think having a propensity towards depressed thinking and then working in an environment which is also extremely difficult can obviously add fuel to the fire. That doesn't mean that if you do have a propensity towards negative thinking, you are going to become depressed if you work in a difficult environment. It's much, much more complex than that. But I sense that if we are entering into ministry with very high expectations about our ability to help people to change and help communities to be transformed, and we almost have our own timescale for that to happen, we will become sorely disappointed. I work with many people who are in a constant state of crisis, and I can look back over years of working with some families and see them still struggling with the same issues that they were struggling with years ago. If you enter into ministry with this time frame and then you keep finding recurrent disappointment, particularly through relationship, then you that can really take its toll on you, and you can become depressed initially in based of mood, and then latterly maybe you can spiral down into the more clinically orientated depressive episode. And as I say, this is a broad scheme, but being real about your feelings of disappointment when you're working in an environment which is extremely challenging is really, really important.
Yeah, and for me, I think one of the keys to our working in Eden communities is actually beginning to spot God even in the difficult and challenging environments that we work in, to notice the little well springs of life, to highlight and draw people's attention to the joys and the beauties in our urban estates that are often so easily overlooked, can be a really profound key, I think, for ourselves, but also for the people that we're working with.
Yeah. I think one of the things about depression is that it's a bit like walking through treacle and everything's grey, and likewise in anxiety everything's like this, and anything could happen at any kind of time, and you're constantly on tension and tenterhooks. And one of the real keys to getting better is it's not about being positive, because when you're working in a difficult environment, being positive, you're just going to get laughed at, and it's not real, and you will run into problems if you're sort of, everything will be fine, jolly hockey sticks or whatever. It's just not. That doesn't work. The key is about being specific. It's about noticing your thoughts, your behaviours, but as you say, noticing when God is at work and saying, yes, maybe it's 80% bad, but it's 20% good. And trying to sort of let that adjust your mood rather than going, everything's over, it's never going to work out.
Rob, why don't you offer us perhaps a model of understanding depression and some contribution from CBT, which I know you work with fairly extensively.
Yeah. Well, CBT is something called cognitive behavioural therapy, and it sounds very complicated, but cognitions, thoughts, behaviours, what we do, it's just about the idea that our thoughts can affect our mood, and our behaviours can affect our mood, and if we can make our thinking accurate, as I say, and specific, not positive, but accurate, and if we can make our behaviours more constructive, then that will help our mood. But it's the thoughts, behaviours, also what our bodies are doing, so if you're feeling tired and lethargic, and also the environment that's around us. So, for example, if there's constant life events happening, or if there's an environment of hope, these things affect. So our bodies, our thoughts, our environments, our moods, and all of those things will work together. So if you're thinking about CBT, you don't need to be a CBT therapist to do CBT, because it is basically common sense. But I think the first thing to be doing is just actually spending time to pay attention to what's going on. And I'd suggest maybe keeping something very simple, like a mood diary, perhaps just noting down out of 10 what your mood is, breakfast, lunch and dinner. So, my mood's 5 out of 10 this morning, 8 out of 10 in the middle of the day, 2 out of 10 this evening. Just do that for a couple of weeks. And what you'll notice is actually your mood goes up and down, and you might even notice patterns, and it's not 10 out of 10 the whole time. And it does get better, and you can have some clear evidence of what's going on. And then following on from that, I guess it's what we were touching on earlier about looking at the thoughts and trying to be accurate with the thoughts. Perhaps just a simple diary, not great long journals where you have a rant and pour your heart out, but just a simple diary, one of those small ones where you just do one side of the paper each day and just noticing down what your thoughts are. When things are written down in black and white, it's more easy to be objective. So, for example, I haven't got any friends. Well, write that down. I think perhaps you have dropped out of touch with some people, but perhaps there's some people who are still friends, and you can be more objective about it if you write it down.
So the key is somehow pinning down exactly what you're thinking and looking at that objectively.
It's out of the treacle, the black dog of depression, into some of the specifics, and it's simple things.
Fantastic.
It's really important that we say at this juncture that depression is not a sin. Many Christians feel bad that they feel bad. They think that actually because they've come into ministry, because they are serving God, because Paul says, we should have joy in all circumstances, that they shouldn't be depressed. And depression is like any other illness. Saying I shouldn't have a cold because it's a sin is the same as saying I shouldn't have depression because it's a sin. In fact, many Christians have become severely depressed. John Bunyan was extremely depressed. Martin Luther, the father of Reformation, was extremely depressed. Mother Teresa was depressed for 20 years in her memoirs. And we just need to recognise that depression afflicts the saints, and that God isn't angry with you because you're depressed, and depression isn't a punishment for not fulfilling God's will. Depression is an illness which affects many people from a great cross-section of life, and we have to treat it accordingly. Sadly, 40% of people who are touched by depression won't seek any assistance from their GP. And Christians, I found, particularly through Mind and Souls ministry, are particularly bad. And what they'll tend to do is they'll tend to be depressed, then they'll go and confess their depression to a friend, and they'll rebuke their depression in the name of Jesus and then try and swallow it. What they actually need to do is to take advice, and very often actually to see their GP as a first port of call, and then to begin tracking recovery. The great thing is that depression is highly treatable, and you can make a great recovery. But if you start with that religious stigma, then actually your recovery becomes a lot more complex.
Yeah. Thank you. And obviously, equally, when we're working with people in the community, often our expectation can be that on becoming Christians, their depression will be sorted out. And often that's not the case. When you're working long term, you see people go through the full range of journey with their faith. And it's so important, I think, what you highlight there, to really be aware of an ongoing journey. We need to stop now for a break and allow you to carry on the discussion in your small groups. But we'll be back again very shortly. Thank you. Well, welcome back to the second half of our session on depression and anxiety. I'm here with Will and Rob from Mind and Soul Network, and thank you for being with us. So perhaps just unpack for us, Rob, a little bit more about the distinction between depression and anxiety. They're two terms that we hear bandied around a lot. How would you describe the distinction between them?
Definitely. Well, they do sort of come together. They're both huge terms, and I guess you'd sort of bung stress and low self-esteem and a few other things in there as well. One of the things that psychologists and psychiatrists have worked out over the past sort of 50, 100 years or so is that there's certain things that are common and cluster together, and actually if we can have an understanding of those, then we can actually get some specific help. So for example, in depression, we've talked a little bit before about how these different areas, these 5 areas can come together, but in depression it's particularly about the self being thought of as worthless, the future being very negative, other people as quite critical, whereas in anxiety there's a different triad that happens. So for example, the future is uncertain, other people are threatening, the self is vulnerable. In depression, there's some things that go on. There's lots of shoulds and musts and oughts and expectations that we put upon ourselves, which we talked about in one of the other videos here. But there's also sort of lots of biases. So, for example, supposing you've had a weekend and you're looking back on the weekend, you'll tend to remember the things that went badly rather than the things that went well. Likewise, in anxiety, you'll tend to remember the threat triggers. So, for example, if you walk into a room, your first thought probably will be, I wonder which of these people I can trust, rather than, oh, what a nice room of people. I might have some nice conversations today. So our brains are sort of prioritised towards these different things. And anxiety is quite a big thing as well. So there's a range of things within anxiety. There's simple panic attacks where the body just misinterprets often what's going on. So it could be just a palpitation, an extra heartbeat. You could be a bit sweaty. The body, because it's scanning, because it's looking out for these threats, turns that into you're ill. You could die, and then you're having a panic attack and you're hyperventilating. Other kinds of things are different. So, for example, agoraphobia, where people don't go out of the house. What's often happened then is people have learnt that avoiding situations makes it feel easier because you don't have the panic attacks. If you're not going out, you don't have the panic attacks. You're just in the house and you feel better. But the problem about agoraphobia is that it's not that the anxiety's gone down to zero. In actual fact, the anxiety's gone down to about 10%. And it's this chronic grumbling, worrying, and that's actually quite an unpleasant place to be in. High stress levels, and that in itself can turn into depression because you're no longer doing some of the things that you were doing before. So I guess the message is there's a range of different things out there, and there's now some fantastic self-help books out there. There's great help you can get which are actually really specific, and because we understand these different types of illnesses, I could touch on bulimia, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's other things out there. There's specific help. Books have been written about this because you're not the only person who has these kinds of problems. They're common, and we understand them, and help is available.
So in the first segment, you outlined a bit of a cognitive behavioural therapy model for identifying thoughts and beginning to bring some objectivity to those thoughts. So should, all of our Eden teams around the country just begin to, get a bit of a crash course in this and start doing it with their friends and neighbours? How can we integrate this perhaps with our ministry in a way that's helpful to people and helpful to us?
Definitely. Well, I mean, CBT first and foremost is just common sense. It's just slowing down, taking the time to do something like reflecting or keeping a simple diary, and just being aware that these different parts of your life, so your thoughts and your behaviours and your environment and your mood and also your spirituality, interplay. So it's just being aware of those things. So what I'd suggest for your average person on an Eden team is that they don't become amateur psychotherapists, but perhaps they've just got an ear open for some of these shoulds, must, oughts, nevers, always, some of these kinds of words. And, it can just be a matter of raising a cautious eyebrow. Always? Is it really always? What would it mean if it wasn't always? Could it be not always? Just simple things like that. And also perhaps thinking, well, there's such a lot going on here, but is there one thing I could change? Perhaps I could just help this person's body. Perhaps I could just give them a nice square meal. And that actually can raise your mood and your thoughts and everything else, just because you've helped the body. A good night's sleep, some babysitting. So you're not actually doing therapy in that clever sort of psychological sense, but you're impacting this cycle.
Yeah, so you're relating to people with an awareness of what those influencing factors are, and then by raising one, you actually impact the whole picture.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When is it right to refer on, and how do we begin to think about referring people on?
Well, common problems are common and often have fairly simple solutions. So, for example, giving someone a meal, helping someone out with some babysitting, just allowing them to talk and reflect on their feelings. Perhaps for more mild depression and anxiety, that might be enough, and the problem will begin to unwind. What you often find, though, in more severe problems is that something gets stuck. So despite sorting everything else out, despite sorting out benefits, finances, food, basic things, trying to get the person out of the house a little bit, the thoughts continue to be negative, and it's really just a sticking pin that's pinning the whole thing down. That's a good time to to be getting help. And also, of course, when people are very depressed or very anxious, they're not really able to engage in talking therapies, and they might need more specific support from services or medication to get them from that sort of 0 out of 10 to 5 out of 10. Talking therapies are great from 5 out of 10 back to 10 out of 10 and then on into health. But for the really dense sort of, for people who are very depressed, it's actually very difficult to generate a single positive thought. And in that sense, a talking therapy is actually going to make someone feel worse because you're just going to be hitting them over the head with it and they can't respond.
So let's talk a little bit about the pastoral kind of issues in working with people in that kind of state. Will, why don't you share from your experience?
Well, engaging with this, I think we would want to say initially, isn't as frightening as it might sound. And, we have to be careful that we identify both the difference between being a clinician, like Rob, who's a psychiatrist, and being a minister on an Eden team, for example. And what we don't want is for people to become pop psychologists or pop psychiatrists and start trying to deliver the sort of work that should actually be passed on to professional services. What we do want to do is empower people to be more psychologically aware of both their clients, those people that they're working with, and of themselves. And working with people who have severe and enduring mental health problems, or particularly more neurotic-based problems like depression and anxiety and eating disorders and the like, carries a personal cost. There's a pastoral, a personal burden to these things. And psychologists talk about an experience we call transference, where two people in an engaged conversation will be sharing goods. And typically the understanding of transference is that the client pushes subconsciously material into the person who is supporting them. There's something called countertransference when the person who's doing the listening subconsciously pushes those things back or pushes their own things back towards the client. Now, you don't need to be too worried about what this looks like, but in practical terms, this can mean on an Eden team, when you go and visit someone who potentially is severely depressed, and you spend time with them, you might come away from that meeting, as people very often do, feeling very heavy and actually feeling quite low themselves. Now, that is an experience, if you like, technically, of transference, that they've come away carrying some of the feelings that the person that they've been supporting has pushed into them or onto them. I think it's really important to recognise that we don't believe in an impotent God. We believe in a God of power and authority, a sovereign God whose spirit is at work in us. And actually, he is present in these environments. Therefore, pastorally, it's essential that we come in not in our own strength again, but in the strength of the one who sent us. It's essential, I believe, to be praying as we're serving people who are suffering from mental health problems. I work with a number of people who are suicidal, and for some great period of time have been telling me that their death is imminent. Now, initially, because of my anxiety, that fear of them killing themselves has led me to suffer from anxiety relative to their well-being. But moving into a place of trusting God for his children, of prayerfully approaching them and praying through our transactions, and also walking away and actually then passing over to a supervisor or a trusted friend in prayer some of the burdens I'm feeling from that meeting helps me to stay well. The key thing isn't to own the material that belongs to your client. Don't carry the burdens that they push into you. Actually, pray them through and pass them on in a prayerful and supportive way. And also, always remember that whilst we're here supportive of psychotherapy and psychiatry and medication, we also believe in a God who heals today. We believe in his supernatural power to heal. And we must always be praying actively that God would bring his power to heal in this situation. Sometimes that healing isn't what we'd expect or what we'd envisaged, but I believe that when we pray for healing in the power of the Holy Spirit, a healing will come. Whether it's the one we're looking for or not, a healing will come.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely. And so are there some kind of basics that we can kind of talk through to help people in their engaging with either their own state of mental health, their own low mood, or that of the people around them? Perhaps some really basic practical things that we can give people.
Well, we've been talking about clever things like thoughts and keeping a diary and that kind of stuff, and I think we also need to be practical and actually say, well, the first thing humans need is safety. If you're being chased by a large bear, your thoughts are not particularly important. The most important thing is getting away from the bear. I mean, there may not be bears on estates, I grant you, but safety, different other kinds of danger are very real. So safety is huge. A roof over your head, warmth. If you're not warm, that's the thing that comes in next. Once you're safe and warm, then you can pay attention to food. And sometimes food is not a priority if money is needed for a drug habit, for example. So I guess there's not a huge amount of point in doing clever psychology if the person is in danger, cold, underfed, in huge immediate debt. So sorting out the basics are really, really important. Once the basics are there, you can begin to pay attention to some of the fine tuning, and that's where things like building in some of this awareness of our inner world is quite important. Doing a lot to get a good night's sleep. We haven't got time here to talk about good sleep hygiene, but it is so important to do everything you can to get a good night's sleep. Looking at caffeine, looking about boundaries around sleep, no TV in the bedroom, things like this are so important. And just simple things as well, structure to the day. Humans perform best when they've got a morning, an afternoon, an evening. If you are in your room all day with no distinction between the days of the week, no distinction between the hours of the day, your mind will wander into that treacle, that fog of depression. So putting in some simple structure. I sometimes say to some of my patients, can you do one thing a day, even if it's just walking to the post box and back, walk to the shop and back. Just do one thing each day, clean one room in the house. Just simple tasks, simple structure.
So as we're looking to conclude now, are there other resources, signposting that we can give to people to help them take forward these issues, which clearly we've just scratched the surface of today?
Well, you can look at the Mind Soul website, mindsoul.info, where we've got a whole array of different resources and reflections on these different things. And exciting that we are soon to release a selection of ebooks on the site, which will be free to use and actually guide people through various issues using cognitive behavioural therapy techniques. It's also important to understand your network. If you're working for Eden, you need to know on the ground in your location who are the GPs, who is running the mental health services locally, and is there provision for referrals to be made directly, or do those referrals need to be made through the GP? Are there trusted counsellors who are available at low cost from local services or from the local church? Is your church mental health friendly, and does the vicar there or the pastor there understand and support people with mental health problems? If so, could that be a place where you could direct people who are struggling in your community? And around you, is there a network of people who are trusted, with whom you can share your own burdens and concerns, and who would be able to signpost you if you were struggling with a mental health problem in your ministry?
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Rob, for being with us.
Thank you.
And now for some more time for you to talk about these things in your small groups. Thank you.